Sections. The sun was setting over the Montana high plains when Samuel first saw her standing at the edge of his property line, a dark figure against the bruised purple sky. He had been mending the fence along the western pasture, his hands raw from wire and wood, his shoulders aching from a day that had started before dawn. The light was failing fast, and he still had 2 more posts to set before full dark. He straightened, one hand pressed to the small of his back, and that was when he noticed her. She stood perfectly still, about 100 yards off, silhouetted against the dying light. Even from that distance, he could see she was listing to one side, favoring one leg. A bundle was clutched against her chest. She did not call out. She did not wave. She simply stood there, swaying slightly, one as if the act of standing was taking everything she had left. Sections. Samuel wiped his hands on his trousers and started walking toward her. The grass was dry beneath his boots, crackling with each step. As he drew closer, details emerged from the twilight. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder. Her dark hair was matted with dust and sweat, hanging in thick ropes down her back. Her dress, once colorful, was torn at the hem and stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her face was the color of old copper, streaked with grime, but her eyes were what stopped him. They were enormous, dark as creek water at night, and they held a desperate animal wariness. She took a half step back as he approached, her weight shifting awkwardly. That was when he saw her feet. One boot was split open at the toe. The other foot was bare, wrapped in what looked like strips torn from her petticoat, the makeshift bandage dark with blood and dirt. Sections. Samuel stopped 10 feet away and pulled off his hat. The wind caught his hair, lifting it off his forehead. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a face weathered to the texture of saddle leather. His hands, hanging at his sides, were scarred and calloused. He did not smile. He simply stood there, holding his hat, and waited. She stared at him for a long moment. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, hoarse from thirst or crying or both, she spoke. The words were Spanish, rapid and desperate, but he caught the shape of them even if the meaning escaped him. She was asking for something, begging for something. Samuel shook his head slowly. "I don't speak Spanish, ma'am. Parbaxrafnauer." She closed her eyes. Her shoulders sagged. Then she tried again, the words slower this time, carefully shaped. "One night, por favor. One night only." Perbat, her English was heavily accented, each word a small struggle, but the meaning was clear. She was asking for shelter. One night. She held up a single finger to emphasize the point, her hand trembling. Par favor. Samuel looked past her toward the road, such as it was, a rutted track that ran through the grassland toward the distant town. There was nothing out there. No wagon. No horse. No sign of how she had come to be standing at the edge of his land, bleeding and alone. He looked back at her face and saw the exact moment her knees started to give out. He moved without thinking, closing the distance in 3 long strides. Then he caught her before she hit the ground, one arm around her waist, the other supporting her elbow. She was lighter than he expected, all bone and exhaustion. The bundle she carried pressed between them, and he felt the hard edges of whatever she had wrapped in that cloth. She did not fight him. She simply sagged against his chest, her forehead resting against his collarbone, and he felt the shudder that ran through her entire body. "All right," he said quietly. "All right. I've got you." He shifted his grip, bending slightly, and then lifted her into his arms. She made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, but she did not protest. Her head lolled against his shoulder. The bundle remained clutched against her chest, her fingers white-knuckled around the fabric, even in her half-conscious state. On sections. Samuel turned and started walking toward the house. It was a quarter-mile across the pasture, and by the time he reached the porch steps, his arms were burning and his breath was coming hard. He kicked the door open and carried her inside. The house was dark and cold. He had not lit a fire that morning, and the hearth was full of yesterday's ashes. The single room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room was sparse and functional. A table with 2 chairs, though he only ever used one. A shelf with tin plates and cups. A dry sink. A rocking chair by the hearth that had not been sat in for 3 years. He carried her to the back room, the small bedroom that had once belonged to someone else, and laid her on the narrow bed. The mattress was old but clean. He had not been in this room in months. The air smelled stale and unused. Sections. She curled onto her side immediately, drawing her knees up, still clutching that bundle. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. Samuel stood over her for a moment, uncertain. Then he turned and went back to the main room. He lit the lamp on the table and carried it to the bedroom doorway. In the yellow light, he could see her more clearly. She was young, maybe 25, maybe younger. It was hard to tell beneath the dirt and exhaustion. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing a scrape that had bled and dried. Her wrapped foot was leaving a dark stain on the quilt. Por favor. Samuel set the lamp on the small table beside the bed and left the room. He went outside to the pump and filled a basin with cold water. He found a clean cloth in the chest by the dry sink, one of the few that remained from before. He carried both back to the bedroom. Paikro. She had not moved. He set the basin on the floor beside the bed and knelt there, his knees cracking. Slowly, carefully, he reached for her injured foot. She flinched at the first touch, but did not pull away. He unwrapped the makeshift bandage, revealing a foot that was torn and blistered, the sole cut in several places by rocks or glass. He dipped the cloth in the water and began to clean the wounds as gently as he could. Praur. She made small sounds of pain, sharp intakes of breath, but she did not cry out. He worked in silence, rinsing the cloth, wiping away the blood and dirt, revealing the damage beneath. When he was finished, he wrapped her foot in a clean strip of cloth, torn from an old shirt, and set her foot back on the bed, by sections. He stood and looked down at her. Her eyes were open now, watching him. In the lamplight, they were the deepest brown he had ever seen, almost black, and they were filled with something he could not name. Not gratitude exactly. Something harder. Something that looked like determination. One night, she whispered. Samuel nodded. One night. He left the room and closed the door behind him. He stood in the main room for a long time, listening to the silence of the house. Then he went to the hearth and began building a fire. That night, Samuel slept in the rocking chair by the hearth, a blanket pulled over his legs. He woke several times to the sound of movement from the back room, small shuffling sounds, the creak of the bed frame. Each time he listened until the sounds stopped, then closed his eyes again. Dissections. When dawn came, gray and cold, he rose and stretched the stiffness from his back. He rekindled the fire and put coffee on to boil. He fried eggs and toasted bread over the flames. He set a plate on a wooden tray, along with a cup of water, and carried it to the back room. Pavor. He knocked softly on the doorframe. There was no answer. He pushed the door open. Baporor. The bed was empty, The quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. The bundle she had carried was gone. The room looked exactly as it had before she arrived, as if she had never been there at all. Patror, Samuel stood in the doorway, holding the tray, and felt something twist in his chest. He set the tray on the table and walked through the house, checking the main room. The porch. She was gone. Patror. He went outside. The morning was cold and still. He walked around the side of the house toward the barn, and that was when he saw her. Por. She was sitting on the ground beside the vegetable patch, or what had once been a vegetable patch. For 3 years it had been nothing but a square of hard-packed earth and dead weeds. She was kneeling in the dirt, her injured foot stretched out to the side, and she was pulling weeds with her bare hands. Sections Samuel stopped and stared. The bundle sat beside her, unwrapped now. He could see what it contained: a small wooden box, a carved figurine, a bundle of dried herbs tied with string, and a few pieces of clothing. Everything she owned in the world laid out on a scrap of cloth beside her. Or she looked up and saw him. She did not stand. She simply sat back on her heels and met his eyes. Her hands were already dirty, made her fingernails black with soil. "One night," Samuel said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the patch of earth she had been clearing. "I work," she said slowly, carefully. "I work," she said of ground. She had already cleared a space about 3 feet square, pulling the dead weeds and piling them neatly to one side. Her movements had been methodical, precise. Paror. He turned and walked back to the house. He went to the small shed behind the barn and found a spade and a hoe, tools he had not touched in years. He carried them back and set them on the ground beside her without a word. Then he walked away to begin his morning chores. But when he came back 2 hours later, she had cleared the entire patch. The dead weeds were piled in a neat mound. The earth had been turned dark and rich beneath the hard-packed surface. She was sitting in the shade of the house, her back against the wall, her eyes closed. The tools were cleaned and leaning against the porch. Samuel looked at the turned earth, at the woman resting in the shade, and something shifted in the silence of his world. That night, he made stew. He had not made stew in 3 years. He cut potatoes and carrots and onions, added dried beef from the stores in the cellar, and let it simmer over the fire until the house filled with a smell that was almost painful in its familiarity. He ladled 2 bowls and set them on the table. Petra before. She emerged from the back room at the sound of the spoon against the pot. She moved slowly, limping, but her face was cleaner. She had washed at the pump. Her hair was still damp, pulled back and tied with a strip of cloth. She stood in the doorway, uncertain. Peekruam. Samuel gestured to the chair across from him. She crossed the room and sat down. She looked at the bowl in front of her, at the steam rising from the stew, and something in her face cracked. She closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her mouth. Sections. They ate in silence. She ate slowly, carefully, as if each bite was something precious. When she was finished, she carried her bowl to the dry sink and washed it along with his. She dried them both and placed them back on the shelf exactly where they had been. "Thank you," she said quietly. Samuel nodded. He wanted to ask her questions. Where had she come from? How had she ended up on his land, alone and bleeding? What had happened to her? But he did not know how to ask, and he was not sure she could answer even if he did. Paitero instead, he said, "There's a creek about a half-mile east. Good water. I'll show you in the morning." But she looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable. Then she nodded. The days began to form a pattern. Samuel rose before dawn and went about his work, mending fences, tending the small herd of cattle, repairing the barn roof, checking the water troughs. She rose when he did and worked in the garden patch. She did not ask for tools or instruction. She simply worked. Sections. He began to notice changes. But the garden patch was no longer just turned earth. She had planted something. He did not know what. Small green shoots began to appear in neat rows. She watered them every morning from a bucket carried from the pump, in her limp gradually lessening as her foot healed. Sections, she cleaned the house. He came in one evening to find the hearth scrubbed, the ashes cleared, the stones blackened with soot now pale gray. The floor had been swept. The single window, which he had not cleaned in years, was clear enough to see through. Sections. He found his shirts washed and hanging on a line she had strung between two posts behind the house. The tears in the elbows were mended with stitches so small he had to hold the fabric up to the light to see them. Horrors. He did not ask her to do these things. She simply did them. Foreigner. In return, he left things for her. A pair of old boots that had belonged to his wife, smaller than his, stored in a trunk for 3 years. He set them outside the bedroom door one morning. By evening, they were gone. The next day, he saw her wearing them. They were too big, but she had stuffed the toes with cloth. Perfor. He brought her a comb from town, a simple wooden one. He left it on the table. She picked it up and ran her fingers over the teeth, then looked at him with an expression he could not read. First, he found a packet of seeds in the general store, beans and squash and corn, and left them beside the garden tools. The next morning, they were planted. They did not speak much. His English was simple and direct. Her English was limited and carefully rationed, but they communicated in other ways. She would point to something and raise her eyebrows in question. He would nod or shake his head. He would gesture toward a task, and she would understand and begin. Sections one evening, he came in from the fields to find the smell of cooking filling the house. Not his cooking, which was functional and plain. This was something else entirely. The scent was rich and complex, layered with spices he did not recognize. Parker. She had made something with the beans and dried peppers he had bought on a whim at the store, not knowing what to do with them. She had cooked rice, which he had never successfully managed. She had made flatbread on the stovetop, thin and golden. She set a plate in front of him, and he stared at it. Parker. He took a bite. The flavors exploded across his tongue, heat and richness and something earthy and deep. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, she was watching him with an expression that might have been hope or might have been fear. Good, he said. The word was inadequate, but it was all he had. Her shoulders relaxed. She smiled, just a small curve at the corner of her mouth, but it was the first smile he had seen from her. It changed her entire face. Parabro. After that, she cooked most evenings. The meals were unlike anything he had ever eaten. She used the same ingredients he had been using for years: potatoes, onions, dried meat, beans, but transformed them into something that made his empty house feel like a home. Parfar. The weeks passed. Her foot healed. Her limp disappeared. The garden flourished under her care. The small green shoots became plants, heavy with vegetables. She picked the first tomatoes and brought them to him, holding them out in her cupped palms like an offering. For he began to talk to her while they worked. He did not expect her to understand, but the silence had become too heavy. He told her about the fence line that needed replacing, about the cow that was due to calve any day, about the weather, the dry spell, the hope for rain. Sections. She listened, her head tilted slightly, her eyes on his face. Sometimes she nodded. Sometimes she repeated a word he had used, testing its shape in her mouth. Fence, cow, rain. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she spoke. "My name," she said slowly, "is Valentina." Samuel turned to look at her. She was staring straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. Valentina, he repeated. She nodded. Then she looked at him, waiting. Samuel, he said. She smiled. Samuel. They sat in silence as the light faded from the sky. The air was cooling, the first hint of autumn in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. "My husband," Valentina said suddenly, her voice quiet. "He gone. Fever, or in Colombia." Samuel did not move. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "I come here," she continued, each word carefully chosen. "For work, for new life, but—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Bad men. They take money. They leave me." She gestured vaguely toward the road. "I walk. Many days." Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. He thought of her standing at the edge of his property, swaying on her ruined feet. He thought of the 100 miles of empty grassland between his ranch and the nearest town. He thought of her walking that distance alone. "I am sorry," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "You helped me," she said. "You good man." Samuel shook his head. "Just did what was right." "Many men," Valentina said softly, "they do not do what is right." Sections. They sat together as the stars began to appear, scattered across the darkening sky like seeds thrown by an unseen hand. Samuel thought about the empty years, the silence, the slow erosion of everything that had once made his life feel full. He thought about the woman sitting beside him, who had arrived with nothing and had somehow filled the spaces he had thought were permanently hollow. "You can stay," he said. "Not just one night. You can stay." Valentina turned to look at him. In the dim light, her eyes were very dark. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She nodded slowly. "Okay, I stay." The autumn came, and with it the first frost. Valentina harvested the garden, preserving everything she could. She dried herbs in bundles hung from the rafters. She made preserves from the tomatoes and peppers. She stored potatoes and squash in the root cellar, organizing them with a precision that spoke of long practice. Sections Samuel brought in firewood, stacking it against the side of the house until the pile reached the eaves. He repaired the barn roof before the snow came. He culled the herd, keeping only the strongest cattle for the winter. They worked side by side, preparing for the cold months ahead. Their communication had become almost wordless. He would reach for a tool, and she would hand it to him before he asked. She would struggle with a heavy pot, and he would be there to lift it without being called. One evening in late October, the first snow began to fall. Samuel stood on the porch, watching the white flakes drift down through the darkness. Valentina came to stand beside him, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Beautiful," she said softly. "Cold," Samuel replied. She laughed, a sound he had heard only a handful of times. It was low and warm, and it did something strange to his heart. That night, the temperature dropped hard. Samuel woke in the rocking chair to find the fire nearly dead and the room bitterly cold. He rebuilt the fire and stood before it, warming his hands. He heard a sound from the back room and turned. Valentina stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. She was shivering. The back room, he realized, had no heat source. It would be freezing. "You should sleep out here," he said, "by the fire." She hesitated, then nodded. She crossed the room and settled into the rocking chair he had just vacated. He draped another blanket over her and stepped back. "You?" she asked, looking up at him. "I'll take the chair by the table." It was an uncomfortable night, but they were both warm. In the morning, Samuel dragged the narrow bed from the back room and positioned it near the hearth. That night, Valentina slept there, and he took the rocking chair. It became their arrangement for the winter. Poor. The snow deepened. The world outside became white and silent. Samuel's work shifted to the barn, to feeding the cattle, to breaking ice on the water troughs. Valentina kept the house warm, cooked meals that filled the cold air with scent and steam, and mended everything that was worn or broken. Fafuro. On the longest nights when the wind howled and the windows rattled, they sat by the fire together. Samuel taught her English words, pointing to objects and naming them. Valentina taught him Spanish, laughing at his pronunciation. They played simple games with a deck of cards he found in a drawer, games that required no shared language, only observation and strategy. One night, in the depth of winter, Valentina began to sing. It was soft at first, almost under her breath, a melody in Spanish that rose and fell like water over stones. Samuel stopped what he was doing and listened. Her voice was clear and true, carrying a sadness that needed no translation. When she finished, the silence felt different, fuller somehow. "My mother's song," Valentina said quietly. "She sing to me when I am small." Samuel nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. The winter passed slowly. The snow melted in March, revealing the brown grass beneath. The creek swelled with runoff. The cattle, thin but alive, began to spread out across the pasture again. Sections Samuel and Valentina worked together to repair the damage the winter had done. They mended fences, cleared debris, prepared the garden for spring planting. The days grew longer and warmer. Sections one afternoon in early April, a rider appeared on the road. Samuel saw him coming from a distance and felt his shoulders tense. Visitors were rare. This far out, a visitor usually meant trouble. Poorer. The rider was a large man on a large horse, well dressed in a way that spoke of money. He rode right up to the house and dismounted without being invited. His eyes swept over the property, taking in the neat garden, the repaired fences, the smoke rising from the chimney. "You Samuel Garrett?" the man asked. "I am." "Name's Thornton. I own the land 3 miles west of here." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Heard you got yourself a woman." Patror. Samuel felt ice slide down his spine. "I don't see how that's your concern." Pipenorper. Thornton smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It's my concern when she's illegal. When she's got no papers, no right to be here. When she's probably a runaway from some work contract." Sections. "She's not a runaway. She's a widow." Sections. "She got papers to prove that? She got papers to prove anything?" Thornton stepped closer. "I'm on the Territorial Council. I've got connections with the immigration authorities. One word from me, and they'll come out here and take her back into wherever she crawled out of." Peor. Samuel's hands curled into fists at his sides. "What do you want?" "I want you to know your place," Thornton said. "I want you to understand that this land, these people, we got a certain way of doing things. We don't take kindly to outsiders. We don't take kindly to men who harbor them." He paused. "You send her away. We got no problem. You keep her. You're going to find life out here gets a lot harder." Samuel stared at the man. He thought about Valentina inside the house, probably listening to every word. He thought about the months she had been here, the work she had done, the life they had built together in silence and small gestures. "Get off my land," Samuel said quietly. Thornton's smile widened. "You're making a mistake." "Get off my land," Samuel repeated, his voice harder now, "before I remove you myself." Sections. For a moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Thornton shrugged, mounted his horse, and rode away. Samuel stood in the yard, watching until the rider disappeared over the horizon. But when he turned back to the house, Valentina was standing on the porch. Her face was pale. "I go," she said. "I leave. I do not want trouble for you." Samuel walked toward her. He climbed the porch steps and stopped in front of her. "You're not going anywhere." But he said, "I don't care what he said." Samuel's voice was rough. "This is your home. You stay." Valentina's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her hand to her mouth, and Samuel saw her shoulders shake. Without thinking, he reached out and pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, her face pressed against his chest, her hands clutching the fabric of his shirt. He held her while she cried, his big hand cradling the back of her head, and he could feel her heart beating against his ribs. He could smell the scent of her hair, wood smoke and herbs and something floral he could not name. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red, but her expression was determined. "I will not be a burden," she said. "I will work. I will help. I will—" "You're not a burden," Samuel said. "You never were." She looked up at him, and the space between them seemed to shrink. He was intensely aware of his hands still resting on her shoulders, of the warmth of her body, of the way her eyes held his without looking away. Poro. Slowly, carefully, he lifted one hand and touched her face. His calloused fingers traced the line of her cheekbone, rough against her smooth skin. She closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. "Valentina," he said, and her name in his mouth felt like a prayer. She opened her eyes. "Samuel." He leaned down, and she rose up on her toes, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and careful, and full of everything they had not been able to say. When they pulled apart, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "I stay," she whispered back. The trouble Thornton had promised came 2 weeks later. Samuel was in the barn when he heard the horses. He stepped outside to see 3 riders approaching: Thornton, the territorial sheriff, and a man in a suit who looked like he had never been on a horse in his life. Before. Samuel walked out to meet them, his rifle held loosely in one hand, not pointed at anyone, just present. The sheriff, a tired-looking man named Carlson, dismounted. "Samuel, we need to talk about the woman." Sections. "What about her?" Sections. The man in the suit spoke up. "I'm Agent Morrison, Territorial Immigration Office. I have reason to believe you're harboring an undocumented foreign national. I'm here to take her into custody pending deportation proceedings." Sections. Samuel's grip on the rifle tightened. "She's not undocumented. She's my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. Thornton's face went red. The agent blinked. Sheriff Carlson sighed. "Ma'amar." "Your wife," the agent said slowly. "That's right. We were married 3 months ago. Private ceremony. You got papers to prove that?" "I'll get them," Samuel said. He turned and walked back to the house, his heart pounding. Valentina was standing just inside the door, her eyes wide. "Pirvars." "They want papers," Samuel said quietly. Marriage papers. We don't have them because we're not married. Pete Schwartfer. Then what? Pete Schwartford. We're going to be, Samuel said. Right now, if you'll have me. But Schwartfrau. Valentina stared at him. You would marry me? To protect me? I'd marry you because I want to, Samuel said. The protection is just a benefit. A slow smile spread across her face. Yes, she said. Yes, I marry you. Frau. Samuel turned back to the door and called out, Sheriff Carlson, you're authorized to perform marriages, aren't you? P4. There was a long pause. Then Carlson's voice sounding amused. I am. Pierre. Then get in here. You're going to marry us. 4. 10 minutes later, Samuel and Valentina stood before the sheriff in the main room of the house. Thornton and Agent Morrison watched from the doorway, both looking furious. Carlson, trying hard not to smile, he read through the brief ceremony from a small book he produced from his saddlebag. Sections. Do you, Samuel Garrett, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Do you, Valentina? Carlson paused. What's your family name? Reyes, Valentina said clearly. Do you, Valentina Reyes, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Petro. I do, Valentina said, her voice steady and strong. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. Carlson closed the book. You may kiss the bride. Sections. Samuel turned to Valentina. She was smiling, her eyes bright with tears. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, and this time it was not gentle or careful. It was a claim and a promise, and a vow that went deeper than the words they had just spoken. These sections. When they broke apart, Carlson was grinning. I'll file the papers in town. Congratulations. He looked at Thornton and Morrison. Gentlemen, I believe our business here is concluded. Paragraph from Thornton's face was purple with rage. This is a fraud. This is a sham marriage. Mature. This is a legal marriage, Carlson interrupted, performed by a duly authorized official with 2 witnesses present. Unless you're calling me a liar, Mr. Thornton, I suggest you drop it. Barber. Morrison looked between Samuel and Valentina, his expression sour. Fine, but I'll be checking on this. If I find any evidence of fraud, Barber. You won't, Samuel said flatly. Now get off my land. The 3 men left. Samuel and Valentina stood in the doorway, watching them ride away. When they were out of sight, Valentina turned to Samuel. Paragraph 4. We are married, she said, as if testing the words. We are. For real? Not just for papers? Samuel took her hand. Her fingers were small and brown against his, her palm calloused from work. For real, he said. If you want it to be. I want, Valentina said. She stepped closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. I want very much. That night, Samuel moved his few belongings into the back room. Their room now. Valentina made up the bed with the good quilts, the ones that had been stored away. They lay down together for the first time as husband and wife, and Samuel held her close, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand over his heart. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? For seeing me, for letting me stay, for giving me home. Samuel tightened his arms around her. You gave me a home too, he said. I was just living here before. You made it a home. Sections. The years that followed were not easy, but they were full. Samuel and Valentina worked the ranch together, expanding the herd, improving the land. Valentina's garden became famous in the surrounding area. People traveled miles to buy her vegetables, her preserves, her dried herbs. Paragraph 4. She learned English, becoming fluent and confident. Samuel learned Spanish, though his accent always made her laugh. They taught each other, in language and in life, how to be partners. Sections Thornton tried twice more to cause trouble, but each time he was rebuffed. The community, which had been suspicious at first, gradually came to respect Valentina. She helped deliver babies, treated illnesses with her herbal knowledge, and taught other women how to coax life from the harsh Montana soil. Sections 5 years after that first night, Valentina gave birth to a daughter. They named her Elena. 3 years later, a son, Thomas. The house that had been silent for so long, filled with the sounds of children laughing, crying, playing. For hours, Samuel would sometimes stand on the porch at sunset, watching Valentina in the garden with the children, and marvel at the path his life had taken. From the empty years to this fullness, from silence to music. 20 years after Valentina first appeared at the edge of his property, Samuel stood in the same spot. Older now, his hair gray, his back bent from decades of work. Valentina came to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his as naturally as breathing. Her hair was streaked with silver, her face lined, but her eyes were still the same deep brown that had stopped his heart that first evening. "For, what are you thinking?" she asked. "For, about the night you came," Samuel said. "About you standing out there, asking for one night." "For." Valentina smiled. "And you gave me 30 years. Forever. "Not done yet," Samuel said. He squeezed her hand. "Got a lot more years to give you." "Good," Valentina said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Because I am not finished staying." They stood together as the sun set over the land they had built together, the home they had made from silence and trust and the slow accumulation of small kindnesses. The wind carried the scent of Valentina's garden, the sound of their grandchildren playing in the yard, the promise of another day, another year, another lifetime of staying. Sections. Thank you for listening to this story. Sometimes the greatest gifts come in the most unexpected forms, and the smallest acts of decency can change the course of a life. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to keep telling these stories of love, courage, and second chances. What would you have done in Samuel's place? Would you have had the courage to stand against the world for someone you barely knew? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one.